So there you see the title, Creating a Resilient and Cohesive Digital Ecosystem. So let's get the panelists talking. What is a digital ecosystem? Who wants to start?
Terri, what's a digital ecosystem?
Go, that's right up your street. Go, you go.
Okay, so my definition of a digital ecosystem is probably all the elements that contribute to a digital transaction. So anything, doesn't matter if it's on your phone or a tablet or through a computer or some other device itself, it's everything that supports that transaction.
Okay. Any variants on that?
I'd also say the elements that come together to bounce off of that as well. So we're not just talking about the tech, we're talking about the other elements that come together, such as environmental issues and how we respond to that, and particularly in regard to the human element as well. So, as you say, how it all fits together, but also how it's either collaborating and or conflicting. And obviously, we want to manage out that conflict.
Mithran, we spoke before. You had some sort of picture you painted for your exec about what this was.
Yeah, so we, Transurban, we manage and operate toll roads. So whenever we kind of talk to the business, we try and relay it in terms, that they'll understand. And, we've got business processes called trip to cash. So, the car with a person in there with an e-tag going through a gantry, that beep becomes a digital transaction for us. So all that equipment that supports that beep going then through all our networks, through all our data centres, into our revenue recognition, and then to our compliance platforms, and then into our billing and ERP systems. So that whole ecosystem, it's not, and as everyone, I think people said, it's not just about the technology that does that, it's the people, it's the suppliers, it's the service providers, so it's how all that works together to create that ecosystem.
Greg, any final thoughts?
Well, I agree with what everyone said thus far, so there's not too many arguments there. For me, it's about information supply chains and securing end-to-end information supply chains, and what people think about there is consistency and standardisation for interoperability between entities, with each entity has inputs and outputs, and what makes information supply chains interesting is they're only as strong as the weakest link. And that's where often the digital economy is at times vulnerable.
Well, we're coming to the concept of resilient, but I won't get there yet. But what I want to pick up is you're all pointing to the fact that the digital ecosystem is beyond your own organisation. So this isn't something that you can mandate for people to do. An element of it is influencing others to participate in that digital ecosystem. What are the barriers to cohesion then in doing that?
Technology is not straightforward, and so every single organisation might have inconsistencies with platforms and interfaces and APIs. Then there's the challenge that a lot of organisations have is that there's a lot of legacy to deal with. It's often easier to start without legacy, but if you've got 20 different systems or software platforms that all have different terminal contract dates or expiry dates on contracts, then it's very difficult to get an information supply chain to move in a coherent fashion, so that everything is seamless and interoperability becomes straightforward without any vulnerabilities from a security perspective.
Okay. Mithran, you had some views on complexity in this.
Yeah, so I think complexity also comes from a whole myriad of things. One of the challenges we have is we've got all these policies or what we call TISs that govern the roads that we have. So those, those were created a very long time ago, and to change them takes a lot of effort. So when we try and build our systems, we have to kind of work around those policies and frameworks that we have to deal with. I also think that, technology is changing so rapidly, right? So which parts are you changing at one time? And at no time can you change all of it at once. I mean, I don't think any company can do that now. It's hard, it can be done, but it's quite challenging. And then getting all those systems to talk together in and then to create a seamless experience for the end user, I think that's the game. But there's so many parts in between, as I was talking about, in terms of all those different systems you have to go to, and then compounded by security. So, different regulations, compliance programs, so we have to be PCI compliant. So how do those also compliance regimes impact what you're trying to do, and how quickly you can move in any period of time?
Well, I'm interested, given that one of the findings from ADAPT's research is 83% say major business priority is building a trusted and secure business environment, a digital ecosystem. That strikes me as quite challenging when you've got multiple parties to get on board. From your time, Dean, and your experiences, where do you go about that, getting that sort of agreement, consensus on what constitutes the right standards to integrate and work together?
So it was similar situations at Uber and at eBay. I think that if you double click back down, there was a bunch of data sovereignty and security and policy type things that were being pushed, GDPR, et cetera, and we had to think about ways in which we could segment the data, understand the data, right? And so when you think about that across the globe, both Uber and eBay serve the world from the US. Yet you've got GDPR that says I need to know where data is and I need to be able to show at any point that I can delete it through. And so there were some challenges in how do you tag all that information. And what I found is that there are teams that in different levels speak different languages as well. And so when you talk about the cohesiveness or that seamless nature of how you make things work, underneath is trying to make sure that everybody's talking the same language. So when we say GDPR and it translates into something, what are we saying? Is this tagging? Is this data segmentation? Is this sharding information to actually be used, in a certain country, the compliance around that? Or is it more just a compliance piece at the software layer? And so there was a lot of challenges in just trying to get aligned on the same direction so that we could achieve those goals.
But GDPR is an interesting thing because it's the Europeans will say this is paramount, we've got to do this. Mm-hmm. People in America could say, what's it got to do with us? And yet you've got to get their buy-in to what you're trying to do.
When you operate in 700 cities, right, on almost every continent, you have to comply.
Yes.
I mean, the one that I think is the most compelling, or at least the most impacting coming forward, is India. So they have a new regulation coming out here for true data sovereignty that will require that data to be in country, and they plan to enforce it this year. So how are people going to go think about sharding that data again and making it work? I remember when Uber was going into China, they had to create a complete replica of the entire system and stand it up in 3 months in China. Brand new data centers, brand new networking, all of the storage systems, all of those platform elements of it, so it could operate independently because it had to operate behind the Great Wall of China.
Yeah.
And but that's a difficult technical challenge in doing that, right? Mm-hmm. Without causing an impact to the customer experience, I think you were just mentioning. So there's just, this is not an easy problem to solve when you especially go to scale.
Yeah. Okay. And Terri, where does people issues come in? If you're talking about cohesion and that sort of stuff, what are your thoughts about the skill sets people need to bring to the table to collaborate on the cohesion that you get, to get the outcomes the business seeks?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key. And when you're talking about resilience, you're talking about your capacity to understand what challenges are coming to make sure you're ready for them, and then have the capability to bounce back when things don't necessarily go as you would like. And of course, when we look at the skills and capability issues the DC, the digital infrastructure sector is having globally, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And if you're waiting 4 to 6 months, sometimes about 11% of all vacancies take more than 6 months to fill. That's a real chink in your armour. And then of course you've got other issues of changing business models. So you're not just changing tech, you're actually changing the way that you're actually doing business. And then you add the extra element of complexity on doing business in a different jurisdiction. And so that comes with a whole raft of technical issues, but the nuances that different jurisdictions bring in terms of culture, being able to communicate differently. You may well be talking the same verbal language, but there are a raft of cultural intricacies that you need to navigate as well. So this idea of being able to pick up a workforce from one jurisdiction and put it into another and expect it to run as it does in the originating one is probably not necessarily going to go as smoothly as you like. And of course that's where that ecosystem idea comes in, that it has to be symbiotic. It has to have capacity to mesh. And if you don't have that, then that really does put your capacity to be resilient at risk.
Okay, let's get into this word resilient, because we could all be secure, but it's going to come at a price. Invariably, resilience is a risk management decision. How do you have that risk management dialogue with people in your organisation? And I'll come back to you at the end, Greg, because I know you've got thoughts that there's no trade-off here. So let me come to the others on this topic.
I'll start. So at Transurban, there's kind of history and a favourite saying that we talk about when we talk about resilient systems. So when our CEO started about 8 years ago, in the first year of him starting, one of our routers failed in the tunnels. And because of that, it took the whole CityLink tunnel down, because if we can't see what's happening in the tunnels, we have to shut it down for safety reasons. So from that day onwards, resilient meant something very different in the organisation, and we've been very focused with our lifecycle programs, how we build redundancy into our systems, our networks, whatever it is. And for us, it becomes a license to operate. So if things keep breaking, shutting down, systems are down, we can't either toll, or we can't provide the service, or we can't service our customer, we lose reputation. The moment we lose our reputation with our partners and governments and things like that, we won't have a license to operate. So the game has changed. But then my head of networks is there. The other day we had a blip on our network, and our network was down for 3 seconds while a link failed over to the other. And what that did was, in one of our locations, it dropped everyone's WebEx collaboration session, and they had to reconnect. And in this day and age now, we've come a long way. Even that 3-second blip is not acceptable. So we're now, we're pushing the boundaries all the time. And then we need to find, the right partners, the right technology to make these things, again, seamless, because everyone wants always on. One of the verticals in our strategy is always on, so that's what everyone wants.
But Dean, when you established Uber, an environment as large as that, there must have been some resilience compromises. You couldn't just have the perfect world from day one. So what were those discussions with your executive about resilience?
So I think when you're in a company that grows as fast as Uber did, the whole thing was about market share and trying to get to as many people on the platform as possible. And the challenge with that is they had a thing called let builders build. And so internally, the engineers would go back and they could go as fast as they needed to, because it was, again, all about that market share. And then we ended up having 3,500 microservices developed. Just think about that spaghetti mess of all these people doing duplicate services, duplicate things, because it was about trying to get to that market first. We had to spend a bunch of time just going to standardize and simplify. And that's not an easy thing to back up when you're still running 15 million trips a day, right? 100 million plus trips a week. And so, and when you have something go wrong, you stop cities and countries from moving around. There's a pretty big responsibility in it. So there was taking this startup of less than 5,000 people and turning it back into something at that scale with 30,000 plus people, right, serving these hundreds of millions of trips or billions of trips, to try and make sure that resiliency was baked in. And so you had to rethink. You had to go back and say, all right, we did it this way, but now how do we re-architect this? And so there were decisions about, how do you blend across zones and regions, right? How do you blend on-prem and cloud? How do you distribute your load so you make sure that you have a smaller impact if there is something? And how do you have failovers, and how do you test that? And then it goes into business continuity planning. If I have something major go wrong, think of this COVID-19 right now. Who planned for a pandemic that's going to impact and test every technical system that we have out there? Video conferencing, right? All of that stuff. That's suddenly going to be well under pressure right now, and we'll see if it's going to function the way it should. I'm happy to say a lot of those things are working. You've seen Google, Microsoft, Amazon, a bunch of the Zoom aspect, they're handling it. But that planning and that resiliency is critical, especially when things get tough.
Okay. Well, Terri, I'm going to look at the people skills that you need to build resiliency. And an aspect after that is, should we all be automating it? So prepare for that question. Because, so what people skills do we need to get that resiliency right in an organisation?
Yeah, I think fundamentally you need to have people who actually know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But as we've mentioned before, the wish list of job descriptions that have sort of come into being, that we're seeing that the specialisms of the really very narrow capabilities that people were once bringing to the sector are now not broad enough. That idea of building trust and building the capacity to make sense of environmental conditions and critical incidents tends to sort of fall away when people are actually looking at it from a very narrow band of experience. So you may have very, very highly skilled individuals in a very narrow band of capabilities, but when you actually put them under pressure, then that sense making essentially goes out the window, because people react to critical incidents on what's plausible, not what's accurate or what's real and what's actually going on the ground. So creating a diverse understanding, not only in terms of the tech, but also in terms of the people and the interactions with other people in teams, and indeed whether they're in the same premises or elsewhere, is absolutely critical, because if you've got a diverse understanding of how things are actually fitting together, then you're more likely to go with what's more real than what's plausible. And that's the when when critical incidents occur, it's that split-second decision making that is not rational. That's the stuff that people fall back onto in terms of habit, and that's a learned thing. It's one of those things that is naturally embedded in humans. But we've seen it time and time again in disasters and natural disasters, man-made disasters. People tend not to stick with what their processes and procedures tell them to do. They go with their gut feeling. So having that narrow band of expertise can be quite dangerous if you're looking for resilience in an ecosystem. You need to have that diversity, and of course we know that the digital infrastructure sector broadly is not as necessarily as diverse as it should be. Not just in terms of, gender is often the one that is most often put on the table, but in terms of cultural backgrounds, neurodiversity, expanding out to looking at how different people think and how they bring a different way of understanding, again, is absolutely fundamental to getting a better response to critical incidents, and indeed innovation over a period of time.
Okay. Greg, coming in here, you were saying resilience is actually, this is something you can amortize across with other people. You shouldn't look at it as an individual. You come from a Canberra Data Centres point of view, but you see an opportunity there to have a level of resiliency if you amortize that with other people. Can you explain your thinking?
Yeah, for sure. So when I started the data centre business, I actually came from an IT background, so I actually intrinsically hated data centre people because data centre people would tell you what you can't do and all the constraints and things like that. And when I did lots and lots of research and spoke to lots of people within government, because again, we came out of government and that was a good grounding for me, it was everyone in government wanted 100% uptime, but they didn't want to pay for it. And so how you achieve the 100% uptime is a lot of the big back-end infrastructure that you put in the ground, big power feeds, lots of generators, lots of mechanical resilience, and that's what gives you the availability. Then and that is too expensive for lots of organisations, but if you slice and dice that across lots of organisations that are in your data centre, then suddenly it actually on a unit or a pro rata basis for each organisation, it actually becomes quite manageable. So in the early days, we achieved that through being ruthlessly modular in the way that we delivered the outcome, so that we could drip feed capital when we didn't have a lot of capital in the early days. And now that we've got 150 growing to 200 megawatts of data centres, we actually now deliver the same outcome with a combination of modularity and scale. And so the scale gives you obviously buying power, and the modularity and still drip feeding and matching power and cooling capacity to client requirements over the full life cycle of the data centre, that's what has generated the point of difference and why we can guarantee 100% uptime when our competitors don't. And that's where we were at the very, very beginning of the journey. If I offered the same amount of availability in an SLA with no experience and no background and no referenceability, I would not be sitting here today. So I had to have that point of difference, and we've just kept rolling with that forward. And now that's been great because the types of clients we have grown from government, which is our background, high security, 100% availability is the absolute bare minimum, to now organisations that sort of are an extension of government or interact with government often, that also, if they were disrupted, probably like Transurban, or that it actually impacts on the safety, security or economic well-being of Australia. And so they're the types of organisations we look for. And we don't want to be all things to all people, but I do think you can actually have your cake and eat it too in a resilience perspective.
Okay, well, one of ADAPT's core competencies that we see is the need to future-proof your business. I'm coming to you, Dean. We're going through a massive explosion of data. I went from terabytes, I lost the zettabytes, I lost the terminology in your presentation. You built the biggest data center probably in the last 10 years, and you did it on premise. And I'm fascinated, that is a very contentious decision. If we're talking resilience, the day with data going through the roof, why did you make that decision?
We had 93% of our full production load on-prem. And we did that on purpose because it was really a cost delta. So when you get to a certain size, and for me, it's really 50,000 servers. When you start to exceed that physical amount of servers, you can start to put in the same practices that are happening in the cloud, and you can get the same pricing elements from them. And so, meaning that they're able to achieve. And so we had created a taxonomy that was based on Aptio and the TBM Council, and they've got this industry standard taxonomy. And I've used that for many, many years. It allows you to truly see the entire thing. And then you have a fully loaded cost. And then you can have a conversation that's about the capabilities versus just an overhead conversation. So we had this cloud versus on-prem thing happen quite a bit. Now, it was all driven by cost, but in the end of it, it also came down to resiliency, because could you bake in the resiliency in your design from the physical infrastructure, starting from the data center up, and then into the actual shared platforms, and the way you do zones and regions, and then could you have it as a hybrid? So we were still leveraging certain things within cloud for all the front-end terminations, so that no one ever had I can't get a car element of it, I always get a response. And then we would continue to be able to say that as we have cities or other things fail, we've got dynamic movement of that actual workload to be able to now have it seamless. So we either have a minimal impact or no impact to the actual customer. So for example, a standard cloud deployment has 3 zones, and each of those zones are completely isolated, and you usually write to all 3 zones on a database. So I'm taking my data, my trip information goes to all 3. If I lose a zone, I still have quorum between the 2 of these. If I lose 2 zones, I still have the data, but then I'm going to have to do a region failover. When you are within the zones, you don't lose any data. Your trip is always there. The information is always stored. When you do an actual region failover, during that period of time, you lose the data. You lose the connection, or you might not know where they are, et cetera. So you try to avoid as many times as possible to do a region failover, because you are going to impact people. So that's why you build resiliency into the distribution of a region. And whether it's in cloud or on-prem, it doesn't matter. You build the same architecture to cover that. And then you really have to make sure that you can compartmentalize. Remember the 3,500 microservices? How do you simplify all that so that you don't have so much complexity in decision-making that causes outages? And I go back to what Terri was saying. The people that are making the decisions, because the people are still doing that quite a bit, we would always go back, at least in the industry, to look at people in the military. Structured, disciplined, right? Rigor. They really have gone through this, and they are able to handle things under fire. So like you said, if I'm going to have a reactionary type thing, that's the wrong person you want in the front when you have something very, very critical going on. They got to be calm, they have to look at the data, and they have to make a procedural-based decision on something. And so that is rigorous drills that happen in the military all the time. So we, at Infrastructure Masons, are really trying to line up to try and drive more people in from that industry because they don't even know we exist, yet they've got the skills that match really well for that diversity of experience, diversity of thought, and again, being controlled under pressure. Because no matter what, it's going to hit the fan, something's going to go wrong, and you have to plan for it, right? Because it will. If it isn't, you don't think so, Murphy's going to visit you and test it.
And can I just add something? That's where culture comes in that people from the military have been exposed to a culture where they are trained to look at the data, what's actually going on, rather than going to their immediate human response, which is usually not rational. It's more about the plausibility of the thing, in which case you end up with all sorts of wacky decisions going off-piste and going outside of process. So this idea of resilience has to be embedded, however you define it, into your culture, which then feeds into your processes and your systems, then feeds into your organisational development, and then of course it all, at the end of the day, ends up with leadership. And coming from your point, it has to be costed. You can talk all you like about resilient systems and making sure you've got failovers and all these other sorts of beautiful technical responses, but at the end of the day, if it's not coming from leadership and it's not being resourced and it's not being funded and it's not being embedded in culture, then you're really going to be pushing it uphill to actually work when, as you say, it hits the fan.
Yeah, but Mithran, you thought you'd have greater resilience in the cloud approach. So why did you go that way? What was your argument for that?
So we don't have a cloud-only strategy, and I have this debate with a lot of people about cloud-only or cloud-first. So it's very much cloud-first, so we know that for a number of years to come, we're still going to have workloads that are going to run on-prem, so we're not hiding away from that. But we actually evolved our strategy from a cloud-first strategy to then an automate everything strategy. So it really changed how we started working. So all the automation and skill sets and the culture that we had built through our digital program and moving to the cloud, we started then bringing across all our technology platforms. And we really started automating, we call it automate the hell out of everything, internally as well. And that again drove a different culture. And now we've stopped hiring, and we still have a challenge doing this, and it comes to skill sets, what's available in the market, training. We've stopped hiring infrastructure engineers and network engineers. We're hiring more automation engineers, because we're actually really trying to reduce the amount of effort people need to put to do something, because then also you can do it quicker, but it's also higher quality. So that's a big shift for the market, and I think we're slowly getting there. But if you go and look, on Seek or any other job sites right now, automation engineers are very hard to find.
Well, I'm happy to come in with questions from the floor, so if you have, please raise a hand. But I want to ask about automation, Mithran. It seems so straightforward and simple to automate, and yet we saw the ADAPT's research saying one of the biggest technical barriers people have right now is their inability to automate. Why do you think you've cracked that nut, or do you think this? And if you have cracked it, how have you cracked it?
I don't think we've cracked it. We've still got a long way to go, but we've come a long way as well. And I think what we realised early was that there wasn't going to be one tool or one platform or one capability that was going to do all of that automation. But we've created what we call an ecosystem of automation ecosystem. But all these tools all need to work together to finish a pipeline. So it's not, one thing stops, you do a piece of automation here, then someone manually runs another job. You have to make sure you link all these tools together to go from beginning to end. And it is very much about an ecosystem. I don't think anyone's got a tool or capability that can do it all. So, in the network space, it's different. In the cloud space, it's slightly different. But how do you make them all work together is the challenge, I think. And,
Greg,
once people, accept that and then hire the skills and capability to do that, I think you can move forward.
Sorry to interrupt. Greg, what are your thoughts on automation? And I would have thought running a data centers that it would be integral to how do you operate. Is it your mandate and that's how you work, or is it you've got to sell that to your team to get involved in it?
No, not at all. We from day dot, we've had to, because we started off with not too many dollars. So you actually had to think about smarter ways of doing things. And I'd say on a per megawatt basis, per head count, if that sort of metric, we would have a very, very low number of employees versus the amount of megawatts that we manage. But we are probably more sophisticated from an IT and OT perspective relative to the market. And we have had very smart people putting a lot of smarts throughout our facilities so that we can have a single pane view of the health and well-being and security of our facilities at any given point in time. And the less hydraulic you make all of those activities and less labour intensive, it's better, because it means you can make decisions faster. You've got better data to make decisions faster, better decisions in those periods that Dean mentioned, when the proverbial does hit the fan, regardless of how much infrastructure you've got, you can actually sum up the situation rapidly and deploy resources to mitigate any challenge quickly.
Terri, when we think automation can mean for some people losing jobs, what are your thoughts about engaging employees about the use of automated tools within the digital ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it's a key consideration that's going to become much more important. It's not just about people losing jobs, it's also about managing the interface between human employees and automated employees, for want of a better term. And that the interface has really not been experienced as much as we would probably like, because obviously it's an emerging technology. But how people are coming to terms with working alongside something which is essentially a robot. There's a lot of talk in both the sector, but more broadly, this fear about the robots are coming. If you think they're coming, well, you're already behind the curve, because they've been here and we've been working alongside, talking about chatbots, and you've been probably talking to one this morning. So this idea of how do you create a way of working that makes people comfortable with working with that type of technology, but also being able to diminish the fear of, well, is my job safe? And in some cases, it's not going to be. We mentioned this morning about the idea of, we've been here before with other industrial revolutions. The difference with this one is that it is so quick. It is so quick, and somebody mentioned, at least you could go from one manufacturing or agricultural occupation to one that was slightly similar. In the industrial revolutions we've seen before, we are going from apples to giraffes. There is very little capacity to take transferable skills from, say, a base level manufacturing role or a role that is pretty repetitive, that is now being automated, to one where we're looking at data analysis and sophisticated decision making. We're not going to be able to take people out of that job and put them very quickly into that job. So we're going to be looking at landscapes of even more precarious work. We're going to be looking at regions in the world where people are just going to be phased out of the workforce altogether, because you mentioned India, for example. At the moment, very tech-based environments, but we're looking at emerging economies, such as some pockets in Asia and in Africa, where the technology might leapfrog, but the timeframes are so short that we're going to have to take people from one region to another region, thus perhaps pushing some of those people out of the either the workforce or the capacity to be trained, because it needs to be so quick.
So today's data scientists could be tomorrow's unemployed, because the world could change that rapidly.
There's been a lot of, you quoted it in your presentation, there's been a lot of work done by the World Economic Forum, but there is no consensus across researchers to identify how many people are going to be out displaced, and how many we're actually going to be able to bring back into the workforce. It's a very good question around the idea of what's going to happen to our economic systems, because our economic systems are built on, we employ you so that you can buy our stuff. If we don't employ you anymore, how are you going to buy our stuff? So not only are we looking at automation and the way that the workforce is actually constructed as being fundamentally changed, we're also having to look at how our economies are actually going to run. Because it may be that there's going to be a whole raft of people who are never going to be employed, or they're going to be displaced, and it's going to be very difficult to put them into employment because of regional issues or capability issues or other suitability issues. So you need to say, well, as a community, how do we actually deal with that massive displacement, given that we can't train people quick enough?
Yeah, well, the digital ecosystem could be country level rather than just a supply chain in an organisation.
Absolutely, and I think to think of it in jurisdictional terms, I think you're setting yourself up for failure, because you have to look at this on a global level.
Yeah.
We know that the digital infrastructure workforce is highly mobile. People are moving around the world, all the time in terms of being able to backfill or to start organisations, particularly in the amount of build that's going on. You shift in entire workforces. Now, whether that's just for the build and then you have Indigenous people coming in and actually staffing it is another story. But looking at where we're going, there is going to be there's no doubt there's going to be massive disruption. In fact, we're already seeing that. The pace of change means that we are going to be really pushing it to reskill. By the time we've reskilled, those skills may well have shifted, and we're seeing that already with the discussions around how higher ed and the TAFE system and other vocational training is not keeping up now. By the time we've actually got to the position where we're using wholesale automation and cognitive AI, we're still going to be tackling with the idea of why can't we get universities to build courses for us? If we're still having that conversation next year, 5 years' time, I'm not entirely optimistic.
Let me bring this question now back to perhaps something that's maybe more manageable for people in an organisation, which is their own organisations.
Yeah.
If we're building and creating this digital ecosystem, you said yesterday in the Infrastructure Masons workshop, Dean, that you saw the role of that organisation is as an influencer, not a setter of policy.
Right.
And what we now want to talk about is how we influence the stakeholders or the executives and the leadership positions in our organisation, that the work that this needs to be done. I'm curious again, I'm going to get back to your Uber experiences too. We don't get people like you in Australia every day, so we do want to tap all the knowledge you've got from that.
Okay.
Influencing people, making big investment calls, people working for entrepreneurial organisations. How do you influence them on the environment that needs to be created?
On the environmental side?
Well, I'm sorry, that's all right. I meant the digital ecosystem.
Just overall, yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is pretty straightforward, and I'm pretty sure everybody in here has done this. You have to be able to frame a story, and the story needs to be clear, and it needs to be compelling. So whether you're talking to the CEO or whether you're talking to your peer, the point is to be able to get your point across. And so you need to understand exactly what you're saying. And you need to be able to now synthesize it back into the smallest amount of words you possibly can. And don't sell it when the sell is done. Get to the point of what you're trying to actually sell, and then stop. Because if you've got there, you're done, move forward. But if you can really, let me give you an example of this. So the CFO of eBay, his name is Bob Swan. He's now the CEO of Intel. And he was a mentor of mine. And when I first came in to talk to him about building out hundreds of millions of dollars of data center capacity, et cetera, he kept asking, why do you need this money? Fast forward a year and a half, almost 2 years later, and he's saying, I completely understand how much do you need? So it was building a relationship, and what he told me was one of the compliments that I've really, really valued throughout my career is, you made the complex simple. You put it into my language, and I was able to actually understand it. Then I can get back behind you and support it. Because really, every executive's time is about, get to the point, what is it that I can help with? What decision do I need to make?
But you're talking there, Greg, you earned his trust. How long a time did that take? How regularly were you meeting with him to articulate that vision, that journey, that story?
Well, like anything, you build trust over time, right? I mean, trust is yours to be lost.
Yeah.
So for me, it's all around being consistent. So when you go into those meetings, you actually are saying the same thing. When you go back, it's consistently, this is what I said, this is what I'm going to do, this is what's been done. And when you do that, you build the trust. You know, just like any relationship with anybody, it's no business different in business. And I think that overall, for the way that we run these systems, it is, especially in executive level positions, they have to count on your decision-making authority and your abilities. If you can't align with those pieces, right, your decision impact is much bigger than an engineer on the floor, right? So they're counting on you to ensure that you really got your ducks in a row and you've done your research and you understand and you can convey that. So that trust is built by just continuously performing.
Mithran, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, very similar. I think, like, one of the things we do internally is, so it's about if you do something, you've got to deliver on it. And I think that also then gives you the autonomy to then do more. One of the things that I did very early on, and one of the learnings, I guess, from SEEK that I brought to Transurban is whether it was moving to the cloud or automating, I never talked about how things are going to become cheaper. I talked about the value it was going to give you or what it was going to let you do more of. Because the moment we moved to the cloud, everyone wanted to jump on. So actually, the cloud became more expensive because there were more people using it, right? But it allowed more people to do more things concurrently, and that's what automation allows you to do as well. So it's just about getting the language right and getting people to buy into that. Yeah. And then again, you've got to deliver.
Period.
Okay. You're talking also there about one of the other great discussions points around this topic, OPEX versus CAPEX, whether you need to make big ticket investments or whether it is actually a steady investment over time and period and all that. And I'll come to you first, Mithran, on that, and then I'll be interested in your thoughts, Greg.
Yes, I mean, we had, just as we had to take our engineers on this journey, we had to take legal and our finance team through that journey as well. I think at the end of it, as long as the company starts talking about cash rather than OPEX and CAPEX, if you can get them to that point, you've kind of, you've won a little bit of the battle. We've moved a lot of systems to SaaS applications. So we're on Workday, we've got ServiceNow, we've got lots of systems that are now in that sort of OPEX sort of view. But when you're building these systems, you can still CAPEX those costs as well, right? So there's a period of time you can CAPEX it. As you're building capability, then it goes into an OPEX model. But there's ways that all these companies that are providing SaaS services allow you to either look at a CAPEX model or an OPEX model. It's just what suits you the best and how, depending on how your finance team wants to run.
Greg, I assume you want everything to be OPEX, is that right? All your clients pay you on a monthly basis for your services, or is there arguments that you can see for CAPEX?
No, not at all. Like we build data centres, so we're a CAPEX intensive operation, but there's actually there's a lot of value in that approach as well. What people again, I'm not running IT systems, I'm building data centres, so it's a little bit different. But what people fail to sort of understand sometimes is the value of money over time and the timing of the CAPEX and how tightly you can hold that to the very last minute and drip feed that in over time actually means that you can build more expensive, more resilient, more redundant buildings, but actually at a lower total cost of ownership than if you went big bang with all of your CAPEX on day one. Because having $1 billion or more out the door to banks is not cheap. Yeah. So I don't mind CAPEX, but I think about money as cash, not CAPEX and OPEX, because it's generally my money. And so I don't want to give $1 to anybody unless it's absolutely necessary.
And yet, Greg, Dean, you were talking to me yesterday about how OPEX you lose control very quickly in that sort of environment, and there's a sort of rigor around capital investments. Could you sort of elaborate a bit more on that?
Sure. Yeah, I echo what he was just saying. When people have a spigot they can turn on, they will. So when they go in the cloud and you don't have governance and controls in place, then they'll just spend because they're just doing their job, they're getting things done, they're spinning up instances, et cetera. So it doesn't matter if you're on-prem or cloud, et cetera, you really need to keep your ducks in a row. And I talked about that taxonomy. If you're able to go see it, then you can make decisions on it. You can see when there's outliers, things that change, and then you can actually get a hold of them quicker. Instead of, oh my goodness, I have another $10 million on my cloud bill this month. How did that happen, right? Well, because you didn't govern it. So I think that, you know, OpEx, when you move it out of a CapEx, like building your own data centers and that kind of thing, into a model of colo or those things, or cloud, you just need to keep that cash under control. And that really is all about a taxonomy. If you can't change what you don't measure, right? If you don't look at it, you're definitely going to get hit by it.